The moonlight illuminated Sarah Whitmore's figure as she stepped lightly across the floorboards, her heart hammering in her chest. There were no sounds of the usual ranch activities this time of night, no hooves clicking against stone, no voices shouting orders. Just the eerie silence that had settled in the wake of her father's terrible decision. For 3 weeks, Sarah had been adjusting to a new life, though she had yet to come to terms with how drastically it had changed. It wasn't just the loss of her home or her family's legacy. It was the weight of everything her father had gambled away. The one thing she never thought could be lost had been, and now she was here, in the Circle W Ranch. A place of power, fear, and an unsettling freedom she couldn't fully embrace. She had walked into the ranch house the previous night with her head held high, determined to keep her dignity intact no matter the cost. The grand rooms, the polished floors, the servants, the wealth. Everything seemed like another world compared to the modest homestead where she had grown up. And then there was Colt Brennan, the giant cowboy who had won her in a poker game. His reputation preceded him. A man feared and respected from Montana to Texas. His hands were large, rough, capable of breaking a man in two without a second thought. But it was his eyes, cold and calculating, that made Sarah feel the most unsettled. The distant echoes of the night seemed to drown in the heavy, unnerving silence of the house. Sarah could almost feel Colt's eyes on her, despite him not being physically present. The way he had touched her that first night, lifting her from the horse like she weighed nothing at all, was still fresh in her mind. His hands had been careful, not necessarily gentle, but precise, like a man accustomed to taking what he wanted, no questions asked. And Sarah had let him, but now, tonight, she would face him again. She had made her choice, though her heart was still tangled in confusion. Her heart pounded as she stood before Colt's bedroom door, one hand resting lightly against the cool wood. 3 weeks had passed, and yet she was still so unsure. She had no control over how she had arrived here, but she could control how she responded moving forward. She could choose to remain closed off or let go of the past. And now, with this door between her and the man who had won her, she was about to make another decision. The knock on the door felt too soft for what she was about to face, but she lifted her hand and tapped against the wood. Her breath was quick, shallow, but she stood firm. This was her choice, her future. And even if Colt Brennan was a man who could destroy her with a single word, Sarah Whitmore would not back down. The door swung open slowly, and there he was, Colt Brennan, towering in the doorway, his presence overpowering the dim light from the oil lamp on the table beside him. He was different tonight. Gone was the imposing figure of the man who had bargained away her life. In his place was someone quieter, more subdued, his posture not rigid, but relaxed. His large hands were folded behind his back, but even in that moment, Sarah knew that he was a man who always remained in control. It was not dominance she felt when he stood in front of her, but the weight of understanding. Sarah was unsure how to respond. Should she act as though everything had changed? Should she apologize, beg for forgiveness? The vastness of the Circle W Ranch, its grand rooms, its long hallways, all seemed to dwarf her now. Colt had given her a room, given her a place, but it still didn't feel like home. There was nothing familiar about it except for the memories of that awful night, the night she had been handed over like property. But tonight, as she stood before him, a different energy swirled between them. There was an undercurrent of something more than just a man claiming what was his. The pull between them was undeniable, like gravity drawing them closer. She had thought her resentment would shield her from him, but in his presence, it began to fade, slipping away like sand through fingers. Sarah, Colt said her name softly, his deep voice reverberating against the walls. She swallowed the lump in her throat. It was the first time he had said her name without an ounce of mockery, and it unsettled her more than if he had shouted at her. His eyes, cold and gray like storm clouds, never left hers. "I'm here, Colt," she answered, the words sounding too breathless even to her own ears. A flicker of something, maybe approval or curiosity, passed over his features. He studied her, his gaze sweeping from the top of her head to the tips of her boots, making her feel suddenly exposed. She had always been taught to keep her emotions in check, but here, in his presence, it felt impossible to conceal what she felt. "Come in," he said, his voice low and steady. She hesitated for a brief moment, taking a step forward only when she was sure she would not turn and run. She moved through the door, her body responding against her will to the unspoken invitation. She couldn't look at him yet. Not when the weight of her decisions and her father's betrayal still hung over her like a thick, suffocating fog. "I've been waiting for you to decide," Colt said as he closed the door behind her, his voice thick with a promise Sarah couldn't quite place. She straightened, forcing herself to face him as the door clicked shut. "You said it was my choice," she said quietly, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. His lips curled into the faintest of smiles, as though he found her resistance both amusing and admirable. He approached her slowly, his footsteps heavy but deliberate, making her heart beat faster. It wasn't just fear she felt anymore. There was something else. Something she couldn't name, but that made the air feel hotter, thicker. "You think I don't know how hard it is to make a choice like this?" he asked, his words cutting through the air. His gaze softened for a moment, as though he understood the weight of the decision she was carrying, though he would never show it. "But here's the thing, Sarah. You've already made a choice. You're here, and that's what matters." Sarah opened her mouth to respond, but the words faltered before she could speak. How could she argue with that? She was here because her father had gambled her away, yes. But somewhere in the last 3 weeks, she had stopped being a victim and started becoming something more. Something she didn't yet understand, but was eager to discover. Colt took another step closer. His scent filled the room, leather, smoke, and something primal. Something that made her pulse quicken. And before she could stop herself, before she could think to escape, he reached out, his rough hands taking her face in both of his. "You don't have to be afraid," he murmured, brushing his thumb across her cheek as though soothing a frightened child. "Not anymore. I'm not going to force you to do anything." For a long moment, Sarah stood frozen, caught in the storm of conflicting emotions that rolled through her. Fear, yes, but also curiosity, longing, and something much more powerful than she cared to admit. And then, before she could say anything else, Colt leaned down, his lips brushing against her forehead. His kiss was gentle, unexpected, and it took Sarah's breath away. It was nothing like the fiery kiss she'd imagined when she first saw him. No, this was something softer, more intimate, a promise without words. But it was enough. It made her realize that no matter what had happened before, no matter the way she had been won in a card game, she was not without agency. She could still choose. And the choice, no matter how difficult, no matter how confusing, was hers to make. The sun was still low when Sarah woke. The early light spilling through the window and casting long, soft shadows across the room. She stirred beneath the covers, her mind still hazy with the remnants of the night before. It was hard to shake off the confusion, the uncertainty that had plagued her for weeks. But the events of last night, those intimate moments with Colt, had started to blur the lines between what she feared and what she desired. She had gone to his door, made a decision, and felt something shift in her soul. The kiss they shared had been gentle, yet there had been a force behind it, a promise of something more. Sarah couldn't quite make sense of it all. How could she? Her world had been turned upside down in a way she couldn't have predicted. She had been brought here as a wager, a piece in a dangerous game of luck and risk. Yet now, there was more than just the bitterness of being lost in a gamble. There was something else, something she couldn't name, but something undeniably real. Her body ached with the tension of the choices still before her, and her heart thundered at the thought of what was to come. The idea of being his, truly his, sent shivers through her, both fear and excitement building inside her chest. What had she walked into? Could this really be the life she was meant to lead? Her fingers brushed across the fabric of the nightgown she had worn, the memory of Colt's touch still lingering on her skin. The fire from the kiss still burned in her veins. She couldn't stop herself from wondering if last night had meant something more, or if it was merely a part of the power dynamics Colt thrived on. She quickly rose from the bed, determined not to let herself be consumed by the chaos of her emotions. The air in the room was cool and still, the walls silent, as if waiting for something to break. Sarah went to the small washstand, splashing cool water on her face, trying to shake off the overwhelming thoughts. It didn't help. The questions kept surfacing. What would this new life look like? What kind of man was Colt Brennan really? He had been kind, yes, but was that kindness merely a means to an end? Or was there something deeper, something beneath the exterior that was impossible to ignore? As she dried her face, Sarah caught her reflection in the mirror. For the first time in weeks, she saw something different in herself. A certain strength, a determination. Despite the overwhelming circumstances, Sarah wasn't the same woman who had walked onto the Circle W ranch a few days ago, confused and angry. She was beginning to realize that she had more control over her life than she thought. The future was still uncertain, but it was hers to shape. And no matter how dangerous, how unpredictable Colt was, she had one undeniable thing on her side: her own resilience. After a moment of quiet reflection, Sarah dressed quickly, choosing a simple green dress that flowed with a quiet elegance. Her hair, usually pinned tightly to her head, fell in loose waves around her shoulders. She stepped into her boots, feeling the weight of them grounding her to the earth. She could never be a delicate flower in a world so raw and unforgiving, but she could be strong. By the time Sarah made her way downstairs, the ranch house was alive with the bustle of morning chores, the sound of boots thumping against the floor, men talking, dishes clinking. Colt had already left for the fields, no doubt overseeing his ranch hands. Martha was preparing breakfast, her face as stern as ever, but there was something else in her eyes now, a kind of understanding. She didn't need to say anything. Sarah could feel it. There was no judgment in the older woman's gaze, only an acknowledgement that Sarah was part of this world now, whether she liked it or not. Martha handed Sarah a basket of biscuits and gestured toward the long table. "Get those on the table, girl," she said gruffly, but not unkindly. "The men will be here any minute." Sarah nodded, walking to the table with a sense of purpose. The rhythmic work of preparing breakfast gave her something to focus on, a distraction from the burning questions that threatened to overwhelm her. As she set the biscuits down, her thoughts wandered to Colt, to the words they had exchanged the night before. What did he mean when he said he was waiting for her to choose? When Colt had kissed her, there was no demand, no rush. He had been patient, almost too patient. It had felt like a slow burn, like he was allowing her to decide the pace of everything. But what did that mean for their future? Could it truly be as simple as a choice she had to make? Before Sarah could dig deeper into her thoughts, the door creaked open, and the ranch hands filed in for breakfast. Colt was the last to enter, his massive frame filling the doorway. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay composed. He gave her a nod as he passed, a gesture that was strangely familiar. No words, just a simple acknowledgement that she was here, a part of the world he had created. The men sat down, settling into their places around the table, their talk of cattle and fences taking precedence over anything else. Colt's eyes found hers almost immediately, an intensity in his gaze that made her stomach flip. But this time, there was something new. A softness there, a flicker of something she couldn't name. Martha moved around the table, filling plates, and Sarah continued with the task at hand, keeping herself busy to avoid the way Colt's gaze seemed to weigh her down. The meal passed in relative silence, but Sarah could feel the tension growing in the air. The air between her and Colt was thick with something unspoken, something undeniable. It was almost like a question hanging between them, one that neither of them was quite ready to answer, but one they both knew would eventually have to be addressed. Once the meal ended, the ranch hand stood up, ready to go back to work. Colt was the first to rise, his eyes lingering on Sarah for a moment longer than necessary. "I'll be in the stables," he said, his voice low. "I expect you to join me there when you're finished here." Sarah didn't know how to respond. Was he giving her an order, or was it a request? She couldn't tell, but something in his tone made it clear that whatever this was, it was important. Once the last of the men had gone, Sarah stayed behind, helping Martha clean up the table. The older woman watched her quietly, her sharp eyes noticing everything. "You're not a fool," Martha said suddenly, her voice softening. "You know what's coming." Sarah's hand stilled over the dishes as she looked up. Martha had been kind to her in a no-nonsense way, and Sarah could see the understanding in her eyes. She wasn't the first woman to be swept into the whirlwind of Colt Brennan's world, and she likely wouldn't be the last. "I'm not sure what's coming," Sarah admitted, her voice quiet but steady. "I don't know if I can trust him." Martha's gaze softened, and she put down the dish she was drying. "Trust takes time. But you're here, aren't you? You've made a choice, Sarah. And sometimes, that's all you get, just the chance to choose. What happens after is out of your control." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle in her chest. Trust. She had given her trust to her father, and look where that had gotten her. The question now was whether she could trust Colt not just with her body, but with her future. Could he truly offer her the freedom he had promised? Or was she merely a pawn in his game, just like she had been for her father? After the dishes were cleared away, Sarah gathered herself, standing straight and firm. She made her way toward the stables, the distance from the house to the barn feeling longer than it should have been. Her heart pounded with anticipation, with fear, and with something else, something that she had tried to ignore, but that had been creeping up on her since she'd arrived. It was desire, pure and simple. And despite everything that had happened, despite everything she had been through, Sarah couldn't help but admit it to herself. She wanted Colt Brennan. She wanted to know him, to understand the man behind the cold exterior, to see if there was more to him than the brutal force he exuded. When she reached the barn, Colt was waiting for her, leaning against a stall, his arms crossed over his chest. His eyes flickered with something unreadable when she approached, but he said nothing, only watched her with a keen gaze that made her feel like she was being measured, evaluated. "You wanted me to come," Sarah said quietly, standing just out of reach. "I did," Colt answered simply. He stepped forward, closing the space between them, and for a brief moment, Sarah thought he might say something more, something to explain the tension between them, but he didn't. Instead, he reached out, his large hand cupping her cheek in that familiar, gentle way. "You're not just a choice," Colt said softly, his voice rough and sincere. "You're more than that, Sarah, and I want you to know that when you're ready, I'm here. I won't rush you, but I will always be here." Sarah felt the words sink deep into her chest, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to relax. She wasn't sure what was coming next, or if she was ready to face it. But at least now, she knew one thing. She was no longer just a piece in someone else's game. She was her own woman. And the choice, whether she took it or not, was hers. The days following that quiet conversation in the barn settled into a strange rhythm, one that Sarah couldn't quite understand, but couldn't escape either. Every morning she woke before dawn, just as the first rays of sunlight painted the sky with streaks of pink and gold. It was the same routine helped Martha prepare breakfast, organize the house, and tend to whatever tasks needed doing. The men on the ranch, including Colt, were up before her, already out in the fields or the stables, working the land they'd built. But as the days turned to weeks, Sarah's life began to change. Her time on the ranch wasn't as suffocating as she'd initially feared. There were moments of peace, moments when she was alone with her thoughts, and moments when she could breathe without the weight of her past pressing down on her. The Circle W ranch was far removed from the world she had once known. It was raw and untamed, full of the constant, steady work of maintaining a vast operation. It wasn't the sort of place she ever thought she would call home, but it was, for now, all she had. The mornings were quiet and routine, but the evenings were different. When the sun dipped low behind the hills and the sky turned to deep shades of violet and crimson, Sarah found herself drawn to the porch of the house. It was the perfect place to watch the sunset, where the air cooled and the wind stirred, and the only sound was the distant lowing of cattle and the clinking of chains on the hitching posts. Sarah had taken to sitting there, her hand resting on her growing stomach, which had begun to swell ever so slightly. The baby was still a few months away, but she could feel its presence every time she moved. There was no denying that her life was changing, irrevocably. Every part of her body ached with the strain of it. Her body, her thoughts, her emotions, were all tied together in an intricate knot of uncertainty and discovery. Colt had been quiet, too quiet, at times. His presence lingered in every room of the house, in every corner of the ranch. Sarah could feel his gaze, even when he wasn't near. He was watching, observing, but he wasn't pushing her. Not yet. The days passed, and although they hadn't talked about it again, Sarah knew that something was coming. She could feel the tension rising, between them like a storm on the horizon, dark and inevitable. But for now, they existed in this space, somewhere between uncertainty and an unspoken understanding. Sarah had made her peace with the fact that she was here. This was her life now. Her father's betrayal, his gambling, had led her here, but it was not the only thing that defined her. She wasn't a victim of his mistakes anymore. She was a woman in her own right, even if she had been thrust into this situation. And if she couldn't change the past, then she would make the best of the future. One afternoon, as Sarah sat on the porch watching the sky change from blue to purple, a familiar sound broke through her thoughts. The rhythmic beat of hooves against the earth, the sound of a rider approaching. She didn't need to look to know who it was. She stood, watching as Colt's massive stallion appeared from around the corner of the barn. His tall form was silhouetted against the setting sun, the light glinting off. His dark hair. His gaze met hers from a distance, and for a fleeting moment, Sarah saw something flicker in his eyes. It was the same look he had given her weeks ago, when their worlds had collided. That calculating look, the one that spoke of understanding, of knowing exactly who she was, even if she didn't fully understand herself yet. As Colt dismounted, he took off his hat and gave her a slight nod, his gaze never leaving hers. "Evening," he said, his voice rough, but still warm in its tone. "Evening," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the way her heart quickened when he approached. She watched him walk closer, his boots crunching against the gravel of the path leading to the porch. He was so large, so overwhelming, that it felt as though the space between them disappeared with every step. "How's the day been?" Colt asked as he stepped onto the porch and took a seat next to her. "It's been quiet," Sarah answered. "Same as always. I've been helping Martha with the accounts, making sure the house is in order." Colt nodded, his gaze shifting over her with that same intensity. It was a familiar feeling by now, the weight of his stare pressing down on her, making her self-conscious in a way she didn't quite understand. "You're getting used to it here, I see." Sarah shrugged, her fingers grazing over the edge of the railing. "I'm learning. It's not so bad." Colt shifted in his chair, his posture relaxed, but Sarah could feel the change in the air. "I've noticed," he said slowly, his voice quieter now, "that you've started taking rides out on the ranch." She looked at him, startled. She had been careful not to let anyone know where she was going. I don't mean to cause trouble," he chuckled softly, the sound rich and deep. "No trouble. I've told you, you're free to roam. I just noticed you've been spending more time out there than you used to." Sarah let out a sigh, her fingers tightening on the railing. "It helps clear my mind. I think better when I'm alone." Colt didn't say anything for a long moment, and the silence stretched between them. He didn't seem uncomfortable with it, but Sarah felt an odd pull in her chest as the moments passed. Finally, Colt spoke again, his voice low and steady. "I understand that, but I also know you've been avoiding something." She turned to him, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" Colt's expression was unreadable. "I'm not asking you for anything, Sarah, but we both know what's been hanging in the air between us since you got here. I can see it in the way you look at me. You're curious, you're scared, but you're also drawn to me." The bluntness of his words stunned her. She hadn't expected him to be so direct, so honest. Her breath caught in her throat as she struggled to find a response. "You don't have to say anything," Colt continued, his gaze softening just slightly. "I just want you to understand something. I didn't win you in a poker game to make your life harder. I won you because I saw something in you: strength, fire, a determination that not many women have, and I want to give you the chance to choose. Not just now, but in everything. You don't have to be scared of me." "I'm not scared of you," Sarah said quickly, her voice sharp. "But I am scared of what I might feel, of what might happen if I let myself want something more." Colt's eyes softened, but there was an intensity behind them that made her breath catch. "I won't rush you, Sarah, but I want you to know that when you're ready, I'll be here. You won't have to face it alone." She couldn't respond, her emotions tangled up inside her like a knotted rope. She knew there was something between them, something magnetic, something undeniable. But did that mean she had to give herself over to it completely? Could she risk it? Could she truly accept Colt's offer, not just as his prize, but as his equal, as his partner? "You think too much," Colt said, his voice breaking through her spiraling thoughts. "Just remember, you're not alone here. Not anymore." Sarah's heart raced as she sat in the silence that followed, her thoughts moving in 1,000 directions. She was torn between the past that had led her here, the betrayal and the hurt, and the future that seemed so uncertain, yet so full of potential. The decision loomed over her like a storm cloud. Would she give in to the tension building between them, allow herself to be swept away by the attraction she couldn't deny? Or would she remain cautious, keep her distance, and protect herself from the man who had made it clear that he was not like any man she had ever known? But one thing was certain: she was not the same girl who had arrived here months ago, fearful and broken. She had changed. And maybe, just maybe, this was her chance to find out who she could become. "Thank you, Colt," she whispered, the words leaving her lips before she had a chance to second-guess them. He didn't say anything, but the smile that tugged at his lips was enough to make Sarah's heart skip. There was still so much between them that was left unsaid, but for now, this moment, this quiet evening on the porch was enough. Tomorrow, the storm might come. But tonight, it was just the two of them, watching the sky darken and waiting for what would come next.